I'm pleased to introduce our next panel today. We are up here to provide a bit of a debrief on the outcomes from the past legislative session as it relates to groundwater. Joining me on the stage, I have Sarah Kirkle. She is the Director of Policy and Legislative Affairs at TWCA. On her right, oh my gosh, I just had to do that thing where I hold my hands up to figure out which is my left and my right, is Bryan McMath. He is the Director of Government Relations at the Texas Water Development Board. And to his right is Hope Wells, who is the Vice President of Legislative and Regulatory Affairs at San Antonio Water System. So there was a lot of buzz around water building up to the session, and it did, in fact, turn out to be a session focused on water, a water session. And we're going to talk about that. But before we dive into it, I do want us to talk a little bit about kind of the big picture and that sort of thing. And so I'm going to ask you, Bryan, to just provide us a little bit of a snapshot from 30,000 feet.
Sure. First, good morning, and thanks to Leah and the Alliance for the opportunity to participate today. Leah identified three kind of big picture topics: leadership, obviously, Governor Abbott, Lieutenant Governor Patrick, and Speaker Phelan. They all, prior to session, identify certain priorities. Obviously, the budget was on everyone's mind, facing a historic revenue surplus. But other things that you've seen in the news included property tax relief, securing or improving the electric grid, school choice. They've still got some work to do on that issue. I've heard they'll reconvene in a special in around October. Drag shows kept everyone entertained. Gender modification popped up, protecting college sports, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Tenure at colleges was discussed. Other priorities, and I mentioned earlier, you got the governor, the light gov, and the speaker, i.e. the big three. Their priorities, as I'm sure you would imagine, don't always align. So the speaker was pushing for similar to light gov, property tax relief. The governor was supportive of that. School safety was a big issue, of course, after the incident in Uvalde. Broadband was discussed, water infrastructure. Obviously, that was a priority for all of them. Mental health services, COVID restrictions, hardening the border, and on and on. So, as you can imagine, with those competing priorities, we only have 140 days during session to accomplish what needs to get done. That can present a lot of challenges. Themes kind of mentioned a lot of topics that leadership had identified as priorities, but I remember there being pre-session kind of what I referred to as a feeding frenzy with respect to the budget surplus. I worked at the Capitol before disappearing to Japan, and now I'm back working for the board, but there were some lean times that I worked at the Capitol and then some flush times. And I remember, and I've heard it said multiple times, budgeting is probably harder in those flush years than the lean years. And because that feeding frenzy leading up to session, everyone's got dollar signs in their eyes, and, their cow's the brownest cow. So, for us in this room that have dedicated our careers to water, that was clearly the most important need and should be, the largest recipient of, a big chunk of that surplus. But of course, other people, whether you're in the school world or transportation infrastructure or whatever, electric, those needs were priority for them. So the kind of budget, big ticket items, obviously many of us and beyond this room, we're pushing for money for water infrastructure. Parks and Wildlife, you heard yesterday that they were pushing for money for new parks, and Hopefully they'll get their constitutional amendment passed, like ours, Prop 6. And then PUC, of course, got a lot of money for backup generation. State employees also got a pay raise. And so there were a lot of big ticket items. And of course, most recently, I think it's the 15 or 18 billion for property tax relief. So a lot of expensive initiatives, which understandably creates a lot of competition.
Thanks for that, Bryan. And Hope, if I could maybe just get you to, well, and actually we've got these slides here as well. Talk a little bit about the membership on our two main water committees, the House Natural Resources Committee, Senate Water, Ag, and Rural Affairs, and talk a little bit about bill statistics.
Sure. So we have the House Natural Resources Committee and the Senate Ag, Water, and Rural Affairs, which are the two most relevant committees for groundwater related legislation, as you know. The committee leadership in the House remained the same as the last session, with Tracy King of Uvalde as chair, longtime member of the committee. While we had a group of returning members, such as Representative Ford Price or Representative Kyle Casal, about half of the committee membership was new this session, which created a learning curve, of course, for those members, including the Vice Chair, Ed Thompson of Pearland. So that was a little different for House Natural Resources this session. Moving to Senate Ag, Water, and Rural Affairs, Senator Charles Perry of Lubbock was reappointed chair of the committee, which I believe this is his 5th session as chair, so long time experience there. Like House Natural, the vice chair was new to the committee, and Kelly Hancock of Fort Worth, as well as several new faces in Senators Blanco, Flores, and Sparks, who is a completely new senator this time around. So moving now to some session stats. During the 88th legislative session, there were over 8,000 bills filed, which is the highest number of bills filed yet in a session. However, it was a relatively low number of bills that passed at 1,246, about a 15% passage rate. Of those, the governor vetoed 76 bills. As this graph shows, the legislature has passed a fairly low percentage of bills in the last 2 sessions, even with a lower number of filed last session. Those overall numbers were lower than in the 85th and 86th sessions, where the percentage of passage was up at almost 20%, 18, 19% at those times. And then moving on to the bills that were actually referred to the committees, to Senate Ag, Water, and Natural Resources. As you can see, the Senate committee had a total of 212 bills referred, the House 178. I will note that House Natural voted out more bills as a percent of the total they received at 64%, as opposed to Ag Water at 53%. So not a huge difference, but a little bit there.
Thank you for that, Hope. And then when it did come to all of those bills that were filed, tagged reads every title, and we identify and track bills in 4 categories. We track actionable groundwater bills, bills that directly affect how groundwater is managed, and Chapter 36 of the Water Code. We'll track local bills that affect groundwater management, individual districts. We do not take positions on those, however. Similarly, we will track general water bills that affect conversations around water but do not directly affect groundwater management. And then government bills, how districts do their job, open meetings, open records, things like that. So in those actionable groundwater bills, we had I think the number was 27 total. My graph there doesn't actually give me the numbers, but we had 27 bills that were filed in that category. We just had about 4 of them that we were opposed to. There were about 7 that we were neutral on, and the remainder tagged supported. So, however, before we go into this next section, I want to step back, Sarah, and ask you about the House Water Caucus. We saw the formation of the first ever House Water Caucus. Hope had mentioned a number of new faces on House Natural Resources, and that carried over not only on that committee, but in the House as a whole. Could you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was really exciting because we had about 73 of the 150 House members that joined the House Water Caucus. And I think that really shows the level of interest and recognition that water is an important issue around the state because of that wide representation. Of course, the chair was our Natural Resources Chairman, Tracy King, and I think he really understands the need to establish, the 3 goals of the caucus, which are 1, educating new members all members actually, and their staffs about water issues because they're very technical, very complex, as you all know. Second, elevating water as a priority within the legislature. And then third, making sure that we have a new generation of water champions. Both our chairman, Tracy King, as well as For Price, are both folks who have been in the legislature a while, have a very strong grasp of water issues, and they've both chosen not to seek re-election. And so that really hits us in the heart because we love them so much and they are so dear to us. But we've really got to make sure and step up our game on educating these new members. And, certainly Leah and I and, the folks up here on the panel, we're all there talking to new members, talking to new staffs, trying to educate, but a lot of that still rests with you all too, making sure you're talking to your local delegations, making sure they understand the issues that you're facing as well. So also very important when you think about the future of water.
Yep. And we can only talk so much. They have to want to care. And that's hard to get that across sometimes. So I had jumped ahead, and so now we'll get back on track talking about groundwater bills that we saw this session that did in fact pass and become law. And I'm going to stick with you, Sarah, and ask you to talk a little bit about House Bill 2443.
Yeah, so this was a TWCA supported bill, and it's one that we have seen in several sessions now, but it allows a person with a real property interest in groundwater to petition a district where the property is located to adopt or modify a rule. It requires the district to prescribe sort of the way that petition process will work in terms of submission, consideration, and disposition, and it provides a 90-day timeline for a district to engage in rulemaking or deny the petition and explain why.
Yes, and this bill, I will say, put something on your to-do list, right? So districts, you're going to need to do a rulemaking to get that process in place in your rules this fall. So it's effective Friday, and I believe the bill sets out a 90-day period by which you all have to get the rules adopted. I'll have to double check that. Ask your lawyer. All right, the next bill I'm going to talk about here for a minute. An early bill that was filed this session was House Bill 1971. It was filed by Ashby, and Senator Springer filed a similar bill in the Senate side. This bill really was put forth by LCRA, and it was intended to be a response to what they saw as some shortcomings in Chapter 36 after an experience they had in a contested case hearing. A lot of work was done on that bill. It had a number of different parts to it. The focus of that work was to make sure that the bill wasn't focused on one particular district or one particular experience, but rather correct broader issues and make it workable for everybody. So the bill does a number of things, focused primarily on that contested case process. So if you have a contested case hearing that goes to SOA, the bill provides that the board, when it comes back to the board, must issue its final decision no later than 180 days after they get that proposal for decision from SOA. Otherwise, that proposal for decision will become the final order of the board. It has limitations on continuances that can be granted. It also requires consolidation on motions for a hearing into a single consolidation. It provides that if you have a board with 10 or more directors, then in order to take action on a permit application or amendment, you only need a concurrence of the majority of the directors eligible to vote. So that's intended to deal with situations where you have conflicts of interest arise, and it creates challenges in reaching that required majority to take action. And then finally, it provides that a director who has a conflict of interest is prohibited from attending a closed meeting of the board unless you have a situation where you would no longer be able to take action because so many of the board members have that same conflict. So again, this changes things, how process happens in contested case hearings. So another one to put on your to-do list in terms of updating rules. Okay, so next up is House Bill 3278, and if I could get you, Hope, to talk a bit about this one, that would be great.
Sure. So House Bill 3278 requires a minimum 30-day posting of all public comment and accompanying materials related to an initially proposed DFC, as well as ensures that there is opportunity for public comment at the meeting in which the DFCs are finally adopted. And then finally, the bill provides that the explanatory report include the reasons for including or excluding comments provided in that public comment period or at the GMA meeting. And this bill has immediate effect, so it's already in place. And really, you know, I worked quite a bit on this bill just as a means to ensure that there is ample opportunity for folks that are involved in the DFC process to see those comments that are the result of those public comment periods and have an opportunity to influence the process and discuss with GMA members before that final adoption.
And that bill came out of, or at least was discussed at TWCA.
It's also TWCA supported.
Right. And it, if I recall, there were actually, it came out of some lived experience
Yes.
with the last round of planning, that this was something that could be tightened up a bit. And
Yes, we saw comments come in, and sometimes not a lot of opportunity to know what those were and what those suggestions were prior to the final adoption. So we thought it would be a good process improvement, basically.
Great, thank you. All right, next up we have House Bill 3059. And Sarah, I've got your name next to that one.
Yeah, so when I think about this bill, the provisions fall into two different categories. First category is about increasing the export fees, and the second category to me is clarifying the mitigation authority. So the bill increases the export cap fee for both tax and fee-based districts to 20 cents per thousand gallons exported, and provides that the cap on the export fee or the existing surcharge increases at 3% per year. And the idea here, right, is that that will continue to increase so that it can try and accommodate the impacts of inflation. This increase, of course, has some limitations, and I'm going to talk about that on the mitigation side in just a second. But it also makes sure that if you're a special law district, that you can operate under authority that is either in Chapter 36 or your special law. It also requires that any new or increase in the export fee or the surcharge has to be approved by a district board after a public hearing. And note I said public hearing, not just a public meeting, so that's going to be a change. The second category is the mitigation authority. So the bill authorizes a district to use fees to maintain the operability of wells that are significantly affected by groundwater development, among the other purposes that are eligible. But it provides that any of the funds that are obtained by the increase in that fee after January 1st, 2024, have to be used only for three purposes. First, mitigation, essentially maintaining the operability of the wells significantly impacted by groundwater development. Second, if you're developing or distributing alternative water supplies. Or third, conducting aquifer monitoring, data collection, or science.
Thank you for that, Sarah. And this was a topic that was explored quite a lot over the interim. TAGD actually had a subcommittee through our legislative committee that looked into some of the impacts associated with large-scale water transfers and provided some testimony and some recommendations. And this bill captures a number of those. And so this really did, I think, was a good success by Chairman King to get this done. So, all right, next up, Senate Bill 1047, and I'm going to ask you, Bryan, to talk a little bit about this one.
Sure. So this is the part of my presentation that I'm going to go a little off script. Those of you who work with me or who work, we work together at the Capitol know that I like nicknames. Usually I nickname bills before they're passed, but on this one we're going to nickname it after. This is the Produced Water We Can Do It bill. Senate Bill 1047 by Senator Perry is a follow-up effort from a bill that he passed in 2021, creating the Texas Produced Water Consortium. This bill would continue the consortium and kind of move them from the initial study phase into the pilot project phase. So this bill directs the consortium to select a pilot project or program and kind of implement for consideration and implementation by October of this year. So coming up quick, they're going to have at least one pilot project, perhaps more, identified. And then this bill had some associated funding, $5 million. I understand that to be about $1 million for admin and then about $4 million for the pilot projects. So that $4 million will then fund that pilot project or multiple projects. They will then submit a report of the project or program and then make recommendations, any suggested policy, regulatory, or legislative changes. So the board, the Water Development Board, has a representative on the consortium's agency advisory council. And so we, in that role, will continue to participate in meetings and provide technical feedback. Now, this is the second moment. I'll go off script. Those of you who are familiar with produced water, there's some kind of skeptics, and there's some optimists. And I've heard kind of both sides of that story. Obviously, Senator Perry is in the optimist category, perhaps the most optimistic optimist. I think it's great. We've got universities that are participating in the consortium. You've got producers. And if anything, at least after this process, we will know more about the potential for produced water to provide, a viable additional water source. So, regardless of which camp you're in, I'd always prefer to know more so that, we can choose which camp is most realistic. So, thanks.
Thanks, Bryan. So the next bill that we're going to talk about here is Senate Bill 2440, another bill sponsored by Senator Perry. This bill does not change Chapter 36, but it very much affects groundwater. What this bill does is it actually changes the local government code. Currently, or previous to this bill's passage, municipalities and counties had the ability, but were not required, to have mandatory groundwater availability certifications done prior to approving subdivisions. And what this bill does is it changes the local government code so municipalities and counties must require groundwater availability certifications under certain conditions. There is a waiver where they would not need to do that if the county or the municipality makes a determination that sufficient groundwater is and will continue to be available based on credible evidence, and they're in the Carrizo-Wilcox, the groundwater will come from the Carrizo-Wilcox or the Gulf Coast Aquifer, or the subdivision is going to be divided into 10 lots or less. So it really is it's a pretty limited carve out in the sense that it puts that decision maker in the position of having to make that determination in the absence of the groundwater availability certification if they feel like they don't want to make the developer submit that as a part of the process. So this really was intended to address a situation that I think a lot of folks in areas are seeing, where subdivisions are going in and the water supply is going to be a bunch of domestic exempt wells or maybe one shared well for a number of houses, and the water's just not there. And the buyers don't realize it when they go in and they purchase the homes. And so it's really getting at that situation, a lived experience by many. It is going to involve a lot of counties, I think, learning how to do these groundwater availability certifications, because currently I think it's about 1/3 of the counties that have these requirements in place and have been doing it. So there's going to be a learning curve, and I think those counties should, and I hope, look to you all to help them with that process, because really it is the groundwater conservation districts who I think can be the best support for those counties as they work their way through this. So the municipalities and the counties, this does not become effective until January 1st. So they've got some time to kind of get their house in order. But now this isn't on a rulemaking to-do list, but I encourage you to put it on your to-do list, is to reach out to your county and start having these conversations so they're ready to go and they understand what they need to do and how they can reach out to you for help during this process. All right, next up, another one by Senator Perry, Senate Bill 1746, and I hope this one has your name next to it.
So this bill creates a new exemption in Chapter 36 to cover the use of a water well as a temporary supply for drilling a permitted groundwater production well. The language provides that the exemption may not exceed 180 days unless the district grants an extension lasting up until the time that permanent well is complete. And in addition, the district may cancel the exemption if the temporary well is no longer used for the drilling of that permitted production well. So this is about providing that temporary supply, and that bill takes effect on Friday.
Another one for your to-do list. Y'all have homework. Okay. Next up, House Bill 2759. This was by Representative Thompson, and it affects a program we heard about yesterday, Tex Mesonet, and I was hoping, Bryan, you could talk a little bit about that one.
Sure. So the Water Development Board is one of a few agencies that has statutory authority to make recommendations to the legislature each session. Those recommendations, we go through an internal process. Our board approves those recs, and then they most often become legislation that's filed and hopefully passed. This past session, we had 6 leg prio bills. Hope mentioned earlier about 15% of bills passed overall. We got 67% of our bills passed. We had a fifth of those 6 was this close, but didn't quite make it. First time in a 20-year legislative career that I actually shed tears over the death of a bill. Please don't make fun of me about that later.
So, Bryan, was that a bill over virtual meetings? No.
Yeah.
Tears, huh?
Right. So, I'm still getting over it, folks. Anyway, to continue the post-bill passage nickname fun, we're going to call this the Tex-Mez Awesome Sauce Bill. So, Ed Thompson, new vice chair of House Natural, we worked with him on this bill. And you heard about the Tex-Mez network yesterday from Nathan. This recommendation kind of was born. We went through sunset last session, so this was kind of born from our self-evaluation report. And it essentially codifies our agency's statutory authority related to the Tex-Mesonet program, which, as we know, is kind of a network of weather station networks. We will serve under this statute as the lead agency to develop and I practiced this morning, the hydrometeorology network and further Mesonet efforts. It's going to monitor that big long word conditions and establish that network. The network will kind of serve as a statewide resource for, once again, hydrometeorological data and summary info benefiting. And here's the punchline to this bill. There is tremendous benefits to the Tex-Mez network. Weather forecasting, flood preparedness, drought monitoring, wildfire management, water resources planning, water conservation, ag readiness and productivity, industrial readiness, and related business readiness and productivity statewide. So Tex-Mez Awesome Sauce is truly awesome. The bill also briefly creates an advisory committee, and shout out to my friend and colleague, John Dupnick. He gave me a quick update this morning. That advisory committee was formed prior to codification of this authority. Their first meeting after the bill was passed was around June, and one of the kind of fun, significant things that came out of that first meeting, the EAA offered a site for our 100th station installation. Nathan may have mentioned that yesterday. That was a big deal a couple Fridays ago. So props to Tex-Mez Awesome Sauce. Thanks.
I was going to make you say hydrometeorological.
3 times fast.
Exactly.
Later. That's during Q&A.
Or happy hour.
That's what I was going to say. It'll roll off the tongue much more easily. All right. So that is the universe of groundwater-specific bills that we wanted to share with you. Next up, though, is that category of some government bills that do affect how y'all carry out your day-to-day operations. And so I wanted to cover a few of these. It is not necessarily an exhaustive list, but it's kind of the main bills that we want to make sure are on folks' radar screens. So first up is House Bill 3440. And Sarah, could you talk about that one?
Yeah, so this bill requires you to post a copy of your agenda anywhere where you're posting your notice. That includes a website. So if you are one of the handful of districts that's still hanging on out there, trying not to have a website, those days are over. Legislature is forcing you into this century and saying you got to have a website, you got to put your notice on it, and you have to post your agenda. So anywhere where you're posting your notice, you also have to post that agenda.
So this bill was kind of late bloomer, or it changed very late in the process and was the subject of a lot of attention because some of those changes would have been significantly more sweeping than what you just described.
Yeah, it was all the materials, right?
All the materials,
All of
undefined.
the materials. So
Yep.
we got that brought back down to just the agenda,
Yep.
which is helpful.
All right, next up, Senate Bill 1893. Bryan, I bet you have a good nickname for this one.
TikTok bill.
You can't do any better than that?
No. All right, the We Hate TikTok bill.
There you go.
So, a little context. There's been media reports about the use of TikToks and other applications on our electronic devices these days to spy on what we're doing. China has been mentioned in the media as being kind of active in this kind of tech espionage. I'm sure that they're highly interested in what I'm about to say next, so just kidding. So this prohibited tech bill or TikTok bill basically says you can't have certain applications on your phones or your laptops, your iPads, etc. Those devices that are owned or leased by governmental entities. Effective immediately, so there was no breathing room or time to kind of ramp up on this. So I'll speak from the Water Development Board's perspective on implementing this. Our IT department has been very thorough. Now keep in mind, we're not just scientists and planners, but we're also a big bank. And so our IT threshold for being super safe was already pretty high. That said, we are, and this is not a plug for any particular application or company, but we are implementing Microsoft Intune across our Microsoft 365 environment. That when I heard that first, I'm not a techie guy, so I'm like, huh? Basically, there's a new app on my phone that kind of watches what apps are installed currently and what apps I want to install, and if an app that I want to install or that's on there already is on the naughty list, it kind of shuts my phone down, and I have to take it to IT, and they have to clean the naughty list stuff up and then give me my phone back so I can continue doing my job. So this doesn't just, so for us, I have an agency phone. Some of our employees do not, but if they use their personal device for state purposes, if they have the Outlook app so they can check their email on their personal phone, then they have to install this same kind of, hate to call it a watchdog app, but it's just a security app that that our IT folks have put in place. So we're still working through it. There's some growing pains. My phone's been kind of blinky lately, so it's not working right. That's good in the sense that I have a convenient excuse when I don't call legislator's office back. It's bad in the sense that when I don't call legislative offices back, my big boss, Jeff Walker, hears about it, and it jeopardizes my career. So we're working through that. But yeah, I would imagine that this same restrictions are going to apply to districts with, again, district-owned equipment. So to borrow Leah's advice earlier, I would speak to your lawyer about that. Thanks.
Yeah, there are policy updates. So instead of allowing China to spy, now we're going to let Microsoft instead.
Yeah, hi, Bill. See you at happy hour, buddy. Drinks are on you.
Yeah. All right, onward. Another couple government bills. I was hoping you could cover for the audience.
Sure. So Senate Bill 232, that extends expulsion or automatic removal requirements that currently exist for state elected officials to elected or appointed officers of a local political subdivision, and it's for violation of certain enumerated in the bill crimes related to bribery, theft, and abuse of office. So basically, anti-corruption laws. The bill also requires the governing body to initiate the process to fill the vacancy for that position as soon as the officer is removed, and that bill takes effect on Friday. And then the second one here, House Bill 3033, this bill makes a number of changes to the public information law and governmental entities' response to requests. And I'm just going to highlight a few of them. The bill redefines the term or defines the term business day for purpose of calculating deadlines under the Public Information Act and describes what those days are. The bill allows the Attorney General to require training of a public official if the governmental body has failed to comply with the legal requirements of the Public Information Act. Creates a detailed process that a governmental body must follow after receiving a ruling from the AG. It provides limitations on a requester of public information who has exceeded certain limitations on personnel time. And allows a governmental body to request a photo ID from a requester. The bill requires requests to the AG to be submitted electronically with certain exceptions for smaller governmental entities. And the bill adds requirements for notifying a requester of the status of the request and requires the AG to make available a searchable database of requests and their decisions on public information law. And there are other changes in that bill. So again, to Leah's point about working with your attorney to ensure you understand those changes is important because it does have a number of different provisions in that bill.
Thank you for that, Hope. All right, so I think, before we get onto this slide though, actually I want to talk about one other thing, and that is sunset. I don't think I have a slide in here, and now maybe I'm putting you on the spot because I had it in my outline, but I think you can wing it. And the Development Board went through sunset this session, and you came out pretty darn clean. It was a short bill. Look at him going through his papers now. I really did put, oh, look at that. All right, he's ready. It came out pretty clean, but there were a couple things in there that I think might be interesting to this audience to hear about, if you wouldn't mind speaking off the cuff on that for us.
Sure. So as Leah mentioned, we were up in sunset. For those of you who aren't keen on ledge speak, the Sunset Commission is a 12-member commission, 5 senators, 5 House members, and 2 public members. And state agencies typically undergo sunset review every 12 years. My esteemed colleague to my left, Sarah Kirkle, sunset star for many years. And that was actually involved in the board's review. Yeah, last time in 2011. Being a good friend, she gave us some helpful tips. Hopefully I'm allowed to say that. But that was indicative, I think, of tremendous support, kind of water world-wise, for our agency and our sunset process. I will say that under the leadership of Chairwoman Pop, Director Payton, Director Stepney, Jeff Walker, Amanda Lavin, Kathleen Ligon, who was our point person for Sunset, they all set the tone. And our tone in Sunset was, this is an opportunity for us to learn where our weak spots are, and more importantly, how to strengthen those weaknesses. We took a very earnest approach to this, agency-wide. It impacted every single person in our agency. Everyone pitched in, whether it was providing information to commission staff, whether it was reviewing our processes to identify those weak spots. And at the end of the day, we've said it, that we appreciated the process from the staff to the commission to the stakeholders and everyone's input and help. We heard it from commission members, members of the legislature, commission staff, that we did a great job, that they appreciated our openness and our help and just our good old-fashioned hard work. So the bill passed. It was relatively uneventful. I'll hit some highlights. It, of course, continues us and the SWIFT Advisory Committee for another 12 years. There's some standard language for board member training. Requires regional water planning groups to include information on implementation of large projects like reservoirs, interstate water transfers, innovative tech projects, desal, other large projects, et cetera, in their regional water plans. It allows regional water planning groups to plan for drought conditions worse than the drought of record. They could already do that by TWDB rule, but this will codify that into law. Requires our board to develop, implement, and periodically review performance goals and metrics as part of our evaluation of our proposed projects, our review of proposed projects. This was one of those weak spots that we had identified, and we knew going in, it wasn't the fear that we were going to get dinged for this. We were just open and honest in our self-evaluation report. Here's an area where we struggle. Now, keep in mind, our sunset review came on the heels of ramping up flood, and that was an all-hands-on-deck effort. So we only have a certain number of hands, and it's a challenging work environment to, attract, much less retain capable staff. And so that took its toll, and we were open about that. And very much to their credit, the commission understood. We will also, per the bill, adopt rules to allow different standards of review and approval of design criteria for plans and specs of wastewater projects. This is similar to what TCEQ does for drinking water projects, and it's helpful. We don't have to review all those plans and specs for the bigger projects. And then did some repealers, just some cleanup of old unnecessary statute. So I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge Chairman Canales in the House, the author of the bill, and of course Senator Perry, our chairman in the Senate. They were both very open to some concerns we had about some initial language in the bill, and we worked through that to everyone's benefit. And they were also very receptive to some concerns we expressed on some amendments that were considered for the bill. So shout out to both of them, not just for their quote-unquote leadership, but for being open-minded, reasonable policymakers. We've got a lot of those down there. Sarah mentioned a couple that are going to be leaving us, at least in their official capacity. But it's good to know that members care about our agency, about our mission, and are willing to work hard to ensure that we can accomplish it. Thanks.
Good job. Sorry I sprung that one on you. Okay, back to the slides where we were. So there were some local groundwater bills that did pass that we want to go over just really briefly. The one I have captioned here is something that we all have, I think, just as the general public seen in the headlines, articles about Beamer Lake and wells out in far west Texas. There was legislation that aimed to get at some of that. Sarah, can you speak to House Bill 4256?
Yeah, absolutely. So you'll recall in the interim, we had a lot of conversations about abandoned wells, and the Railroad Commission was getting some federal funding that they were going to be able to put towards abandoned wells. There's conversations about should it also include P13 wells, which, if you're not familiar with that term, that's an old oil and gas well that has been transferred to the landowner and is now operating as a water well. And in some of these, like Lake Beamer and others, these wells are spewing a lot of things that are not water. And so, but we have come up with the term leaking water well. And so that is what it is. That is the terminology there. But so this bill gives $10 million to TCEQ to set up a grant program for Pecos County. And it lays out, the requirements of the grant program. But one thing that's interesting and important is that anybody who's going in to fix these wells has to be on an approved list by the Railroad Commission. Again, that's because these are not just your standard water wells, as we all know.
Yeah, and I think that there's pretty broad recognition that it's a great start, but it's unlikely that that dollar amount is
Not
going
gonna
to
go
get
far.
the job done. Yep,
Yeah.
yep. So we're happy that progress was made and
baby
hopeful.
steps.
Yep, exactly. Exactly. And then I have listed here just a handful of other local bills that I know that the districts who sought these changes were pleased to be able to get changes that had probably been in the works for sessions taken care of. Evergreen, Bandera, Barton Springs, all got changes made to their local bills, their enabling acts. And then there was also a change made to allow for ASR in Williamson County into the Trinity Aquifer. There were a number of groundwater bills that didn't pass because there were a lot filed this year. Bills that don't pass, that does not mean they're gone forever. They actually tend to come back, and some of these we've been talking about for a lot of sessions. I'm going to go over these just really quickly. House Bill 3990 by Representative Counsel. There's been bills filed for the last 3 or 4 sessions about groundwater surface water interaction. This one was a slightly different take on it. It was focused on data rather than on prior bills, which focused on more of a policy committee putting together a report. House Bill 4891. This bill made or proposed to make a number of changes that would incorporate some monitoring and tracking and additional documentation associated with DFCs. It also had a provision in it that talked about interim DFCs that raised, a lot of questions. So that bill did not succeed. It got out of the House Natural Resources Committee and was left in calendars, never made it to the House floor. House Bill 4532 by Representative Counsel. This one, I think this was the 5th session that this bill has been around, maybe 4th, but it's been around. And it's really that bookend to TERS, the TERS number, and it would have had a number generated that was the modeled sustained pumping to be considered in the DFC process. Representative Counsel was busy. He filed a lot of legislation this session. He also filed House Bill 5302, and that bill would have made a handful of changes to the petition for inquiry process where TCEQ is involved in GCD oversight. And those really were based off of lived experience in that first petition for inquiry process. And so I wouldn't be at all surprised if there's another effort to get those changes made in the future. Representative King had waste and conservation be part of the conversation over the interim. He filed a bill that would have updated that antiquated definition of waste that's in Chapter 36, included a definition of conservation, and would have also kind of identified that use for a beneficial purpose needs to be non-wasteful. That bill was voted out of the House, went over to the Senate, but did not get a hearing. And then another one that we've seen a handful of times filed this session by Representative Gertis, a freshman representative, House Bill 5052, that would have required GCDs to consider wells exempt from permitting when they're granting or denying a permit. Another one that didn't pass was Senate Bill 156, and this was the essentially identical bill to Senate Bill 152 from last session, Senator Perry's bill that had 4 original parts. The attorney's fees provision, which we've been talking about for a long time, changing that to optional rather than mandatory award of attorney's fees. Would have addressed that situation of unreasonable when a DFC is declared unreasonable. It would have had an additional notice requirement for permit applications, and it also incorporated a petition to change rules. That piece did pass as House Bill 2443. The other 3 pieces did not. It was voted out of the Senate right away, sent over to the House, and it sat there for a long time. And then really late in the session, and this was just kind of an interesting twist, I think, for those of you that were following what was going on, the House actually did prepare a committee substitute of that bill where they removed the attorney's fees provision, and then they added in a handful of the bills that they had sent over to the Senate but had not yet gotten a hearing, basically wanting to see what the Senate would do with some of this legislation that they had put forth and thought was, worthy of passage. So they had got that committee substitute together. It was on the calendar, but it unfortunately died at the mercy of the stroke of midnight on the very last day. So we don't know how that would have all shaken out had that bill made its way over to the Senate. There were also a few local bills that didn't pass that I just want to mention briefly. There was a GCD creation bill for Webb County that was filed, and my slide, I did update this, and it did not take to whatever is here, but that's okay. So the caption on this one is wrong. I apologize. Senate Bill 2570 by Senator Zaffarini. It was related to the creation of a groundwater conservation district down in Webb County. As it was originally filed, it was a somewhat unconventional GCD in that it was very limited in its scope, about 11,000 acres of land only. The directors would not have needed to reside within the district. There was a lot of back and forth over this bill, a lot of attention paid to it, and there was one provision specifically related to the MAG that caught the attention of folks. And Bryan, I was hoping you could just speak to that for a minute from the Development Board's perspective.
Sure. So my nickname for this one is the Tag Membership Plus One bill. So the Webb County GCD bill would have defined a specific MAG value in statute for the new district. This would be a first and only. Obviously, that would have circumvented the established GMA process and probably just as, if not more importantly, removed public participation from that MAG value. Interestingly, the MAG for the Carrizo-Wilcox Aquifer in Webb County would have been 50,000 acre-feet per year. So for a bit of context, the MAG in Webb County, based on the 2021 round of joint planning, is 910 acre-feet per year. So significant departure from current status and kind of first time ever lawmaking that didn't pass. Ultimately, this bill was passed out of the Senate. That MAG provision, the statutory MAG provision, was removed. So we had some discussions, as several of you, other stakeholders had with the bill author's office, and but that bill, I think, got sent to the House but didn't move. So,
yeah, and I think that what was heard in House Natural Resources on that bill was that there was very much an openness to creation of a GCD for Webb County, but that really should be much more of a standard groundwater conservation district with similar powers, confirmation election, components like that, if one were to be created. That was the will of the House, I think.
Yep, I think Raymond had that bill in the House, and he was very reasonable on discussions on options. Backing up a little bit, I think I'll let y'all down on my TikTok nickname. So we're renaming that nickname the TikTok Poo-Poo Boo-Hoo Bill. Just for the record. Thank you.
For the record, okay. We'll make a note of that one. Okay, one other local bill that also was the subject of a lot of discussions related to the Lost Pines Groundwater Conservation District, and it actually did pass, and that bill was part of all of those conversations about impacts associated with large-scale water transfers. And I was hoping you could just speak briefly to SB 1080.
Yeah, so that bill would have specifically enabled the Lost Pines GCD to establish a mitigation program for both either the cost of repair or replacement of wells, utilizing both their production fees and export fees. My understanding is that the district had some concern about whether they had sufficient statutory authority to initiate the program, had been the reason they brought the bill. While it was ultimately vetoed in the property tax impasse, my understanding is the district will be able to utilize the provisions of House Bill 3059 that we laid out previously in Chapter 36 to go ahead and establish that program.
And it is noted here that that one was vetoed by the governor, and also 3 other local bills were vetoed by the governor. None of those on their merits related to anything to do with water. It was about property tax reform. So those all just suffered an unfortunate fate by the governor's pen. All right, we've only got 5 minutes left, and we've got a big topic left. So water investment, SB 28, SJRA 75. I'll start with you, Sarah.
Yeah. Can you go to the next slide? So talking about, this is probably the biggest water bill that passed, and it really has to do with an infusion of money into financial assistance at the Water Development Board. Can you go to the next one? It's kind of easier to explain. So I stole this graphic from Texas 2036. They've got a great graphics department. But the concept here is that money would dump into this Center Texas Water Fund, which is a new fund, and that the Texas Water Development Board would have the authority to move that money into these other funds and programs that you see surrounding that. Now, most of these are existing programs, you know, your state revolving funds, SWIFT, Rural Water Assistance Fund. But there is one key new one that's called the New Water Supply for Texas Fund. If you'll go back just a second. But the legislature said, hey, if we're going to give you guys money for water, we have a couple of priorities that we think are really important. And you see those listed here: rural communities, projects that are essentially shovel ready, water awareness, conservation, and water loss mitigation. One of the key things about this money, so the legislature said, if Texas Water Fund is created, which it has contingent on voter approval, so remember to go vote on November 7th related to it, and it's Prop 6. 25% of the $1 billion that would be triggered by approval of this Prop 6 would have to be dedicated to the New Water Supply Fund. So that's a very important piece. If you'll go forward twice. Excellent. So a big thing about this New Water Supply Fund is it's really targeted to those kinds of projects that are more innovative, generally more expensive, and not what you see as your most common projects in the State Water Plan. You can see I put out here sort of the way that this bill evolved, because for anybody who's kind of a water policy nerd, it was probably, in my opinion, the most interesting discussion during the session, because it really focused on, what do you mean by new water? New to who? Right? Are we talking about new to Leah because her utility has never used this source before? Or, in Senator Perry's mind, I think new to the state, something that doesn't really exist on a large scale in the state. But also, new for what purpose? Are we just talking about drinking water? Are we talking about irrigation? Are we talking about electric generation, right? So a lot of big questions that are involved in this. And those questions continued because, as you see here, when it went from the Senate to the House added a couple of things. And TWCA was very active in collaboration with a lot of the other water associations. There was a lot of collaboration that was kind of unprecedented, I would say, on this front. But, you know, TWCA has a very diverse membership, and there are parts of the state that wouldn't necessarily benefit from some of these newer and more innovative ideas. So I think the stakeholder community really wanted to see an expansion of the types of eligible projects. So we did get ASR and direct reuse added, but ultimately, when the bill passed, direct reuse was taken out. So what you see here on the right is what is finally listed as new water supply projects that would be eligible from this fund. But the board has a bit of rulemaking authority associated with it. So come this fall, I anticipate that we'll be working to submit comments about whether or not there can be anything else added to this list. I would say it's interesting to me that when we're talking about, you know, I get these Google alerts every morning, right? And every day I'm seeing something about communities that are running out of water and drought and that sort of thing. So something that's interesting about the New Water Supply Fund is there's no requirement like there is in SWIFT to participate in water planning. And for those of you out there who have any involvement with communities that are not participating in water planning, I just think it's absolutely key that folks are thinking about their future needs, because there's a very long runway to get additional water supply sources, and we've got to be vigilant about making that happen. So that is to say, it's very important from TWCA's perspective that there are more incentives for water planning and not less.
Absolutely. And you mentioned implementation.
Yeah.
Bryan, if you would speak for a minute or two on that.
Sure. So obviously, we're looking at starting some kind of stakeholder involvement. That'll probably start after the election, so I'm encouraged to hear that Sarah and the Water Conservation Association plan to engage in that. Sarah's exactly right with respect to the new water provisions. You know, the list that is identified on the slide, you know, I see those as suggestions, but there should have been like a et cetera added to the bottom of the list, because our board, through rulemaking, will try to clarify eligible projects and how to best utilize those resources. So we're still at the beginning phase of working on a timeline for implementation, but we should have something more concrete to share around the election. So keep an eye on our website. There are a lot of moving parts on this, so we just ask for everyone's patience, but more importantly, roll up your sleeves and help us through this, because it will take a little time to work through. One thing I will mention, if you're interested to learn more about Senate Bill 28 and Prop 6, there's a Q&A or an FAQ on our website. That's a great resource. So have a look at that, and if you need help finding that, grab me later, I can show you.
Thank you, Bryan. And I'm actually going to ask, somehow this presentation didn't get updated. I apologize. Your added slides are not here. So you've got them in your lap. Yep. So I wanted Bryan to share a little bit about the development board's other funding requests and how they fared. And if you could just take 1 or 2 minutes, because you are stopping these people from having a coffee break.
Sure. So I'm going to hit some big pieces for our budget requests, most of which were money was appropriated for. We got money for rural assistance. We got additional staffs to support the Ag Water Conservation Fund. I know that's important to many of your members and producers in your districts. We also got additional authority to provide up to $1.5 million a year in Ag Water Conservation grants and loans. That went up from 1.2. Data enhancement and modernization, we got 1.8 million and over 5 new staff positions to support the enhancement and modernization of our data. We're going to expand monitoring of the state's groundwater resources, and we're going to rebuild water data for Texas to allow for integration of multiple data viewers and applications. One part that we didn't get was money for TexMez. I mentioned earlier that awesome sauce. We unfortunately didn't get appropriations for that, but we know how important it is, and we are looking at alternatives to fund building out the network. Our flood program resources, we got 19.5 million and 11 new staff positions to support our ongoing flood programs. We got $625 million to replenish the FIF, and with the existing amounts in the FIF, that's going to probably carry us for the next couple biennium. And importantly, and kind of under the radar, we got what's called an MOF, or method of finance swap. We were currently paying our certain staff doing flood stuff out of the FIF, the Flood Infrastructure Fund, or the TURF, the Texas Infrastructure Resiliency Fund. But we got GR, general revenue, from the state to pay those people. So essentially, we can use those funds for their intended purposes, not for a related admin cost. So that's really big. A couple other big ticket items. We got money for debt service and match. We have an economically distressed areas program. We got money for new debt service to allow us to issue $100 million more in bonds for EDAP. And then this one's huge. Our workhorse programs, the SRF, state revolving funds, we got $125 million in state match for our clean and drinking water SRFs. The great news about that is that that will help us leverage an approximate total of $757 million in federal funds. And then we mentioned the water fund. Sarah already covered that, but assuming Prop 6 passes, we'll get $1 billion in that. Thanks.
Thank you, Bryan. And one thing you mentioned, and I do just want to flag for this audience, because I know the program matters quite a lot, is that Ag Conservation Grants program. There was a request to get that funded for the next 10 years.
I'm glad you asked that. So we had that in our exceptional item request. It didn't get funded, and I can give you all some inside information. Don't tell anybody. I've talked to the decision makers on that specific item, and it wasn't funded because they knew we had enough in the fund for this coming biennium. They know we're going to run out. They know we're going to need more money next session, and they should know that we're probably going to ask for it. So that's lined up for the future. We can cover what we need to for the next couple years, but that will be an effort of the board's next session.
I was hoping the secret was that they pinky promised that they would appropriate that money next time. But, we can hope. We'll work on it.
Yeah. What am I talking about? Call all your members now and tell them the importance of the ag water.
Exactly. Absolutely. So this has been a fantastic panel. We don't even have time for closing remarks because we have door prizes, we have a break, and then we have a couple more great sessions. I just want to end this session with, we are losing in the House Representative Tracy King, Representative Forprice. They are so knowledgeable. They are water champions. They are leaders. And we need to step up, and we need to find the next generation of those same water leaders that we can educate, who can then advocate on behalf of good groundwater management. So it's going to be a loss. We've got our work cut out for us, but I think we're up to the challenge, and we'll get it done. So let's thank these panelists. I think this was a really fun discussion.